The late 1960s and 1970s were wild years for car design, and not always in a good way. As automakers chased trends and tried to look futuristic, some created monsters instead. Awkward shapes, strange proportions, and designs so bad they almost hurt to look at. These weren't just ugly, they were embarrassing. Here are the 10 ugliest cars from 1965 to the 1970s that killed style and proved even great brands can make terrible mistakes. The AMC Marlin, produced between 1965 and 1967, stands as one of the most curious and misunderstood experiments of the American performance era. It was AMC's first real attempt to capture the booming youth market of the 1960s, a market that Ford had just electrified with the Mustang and that was quickly being dominated by sleek fastbacks like the Dodge Charger and Plymouth Barracuda. The idea seemed simple enough. Take AMC's sensible mid-size Rambler platform and wrap it in something sporty and dramatic. But in the execution, something went terribly wrong. What emerged was a car that looked more like a confused hybrid of family sedan and grand tour, a fish out of water in every sense, a vehicle that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be a muscle car or a gentleman's coupe. From the front, the Marlin looked promising, wide, muscular, and confident, with a bold grille and a strong shoulder line that hinted at speed. But then came the roofline, a vast, swooping fastback that stretched to the rear bumper like a misplaced architectural experiment. The car's proportions were all wrong. The roof seemed too big for the body, the tail too heavy, the stance too uncertain. Designers at AMC tried to give it the aerodynamic flair of a European GT, but the result resembled more of a metallic whale tail grafted onto a compact car. People called it the fish car the moment they saw it, and the name stuck. The irony, of course, was that AMC embraced the marine theme intentionally. Marlin was meant to evoke speed, grace, and power. Instead, it became a punchline, a car mocked for being as ungainly as it was ambitious. But aesthetics were only part of the problem. Underneath that heavy bodywork lay the mechanicals of the Rambler Classic, a decent, economical family car, not a sports machine. The Marlin inherited its predecessor's soft suspension, narrow track, and unremarkable steering geometry, all of which doomed it to poor handling. At high speeds, it felt loose and unpredictable, with alarming amounts of body roll. The weight bias toward the rear gave it an unfortunate tendency to oversteer sharply, especially on wet pavement. Period testers described it as floaty and unsure, while one owner recalled that it cornered like a rowboat in a windstorm. Even the addition of AMC's most powerful straight-six or 327 V8 couldn't save it. The chassis simply wasn't up to the task. The car's power and weight never found harmony, making it both sluggish off the line and unstable when pushed. Braking performance was equally disastrous. The Marlin's drum brakes overheated quickly, and on long downhill runs, fade set in almost instantly. Drivers learned to pump the pedal and pray. In emergency stops, the rear end often swung outward like a pendulum, making control nearly impossible. In a crash, the story was even grimmer. The car's structure, derived from AMC's modest family sedan, lacked reinforcement, and its long fastback roofline provided almost no rollover protection. The steering column was rigid and unyielding, the dashboard hard steel, and there were no seatbelts as standard equipment in early models. Survivors of Marlin wrecks often spoke of how the car simply collapsed like a paper cup under impact, earning it an unfortunate reputation among mechanics and body shops as a car that looked tough but disintegrated easily. Inside, AMC tried to make the Marlin feel luxurious, but the results were uneven. The cabin was spacious but poorly balanced, with a rear seat tucked under the sloping roof, leaving little headroom. The dashboard was attractive, yet cluttered, filled with chrome trim that reflected sunlight into the driver's eyes. The car's high belt line and small rear window made visibility poor, giving drivers a sense of claustrophobia. On highways, the car's long body created lift at speed, and combined with the vague steering, this led to a sensation of floating. It was not unusual for Marlin owners to compare the car's handling to that of a boat, both in jest and frustration. And yet, there was something strangely endearing about the Marlin. It represented AMC's willingness to take risks at a time when the company was dwarfed by Detroit's giants. American Motors was known for practicality, not performance, but the Marlin showed a desire to break free of that reputation. The company's executives genuinely believed that American car buyers wanted something different, something that combined style, comfort, and individuality. They just misread how far those qualities could be stretched. Instead of a bold new direction, the Marlin became a cautionary tale of mismatched ambition. Collectors today view the Marlin with a mix of pity and fascination. It is one of those cars that failed so completely that it became iconic for its failure. Few cars of the 1960s are as instantly recognizable or as polarizing. To some, it's an oddball piece of design history, a beautiful mistake from a time when carmakers dared to be weird. To others, it's proof that AMC never truly understood the muscle car movement it tried to join. Still, a restored Marlin, with its shimmering chrome and sweeping roofline, has a strange charisma. It's a reminder of an era when even the underdogs of Detroit took wild chances, and sometimes those chances produced something unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. The AMC Marlin was not just ugly or unstable, it was tragic in its earnestness. It tried to swim in waters dominated by Mustangs, Chargers, and GTOs, but it was too heavy, too soft, and too unsure of itself. It became a symbol of what happens when a small company dreams too big without the engineering to back it up. In the end, the Marlin remains exactly what its name suggests, a creature out of its element, sleek in theory, awkward in practice, and forever remembered as one of the strangest and most fascinating missteps in American automotive history.
The Renault 16, introduced in 1965, was a car that revolutionized the European family segment, yet managed to frighten and frustrate many of its owners in equal measure. It was the world's first true large family hatchback, a groundbreaking idea at the time. In an era when sedans and wagons ruled, Renault dared to combine the practicality of both in one vehicle. It offered space, versatility, and a new kind of comfort that made long drives bearable for middle-class families. It was elegant in theory, innovative in execution, and disastrous in certain moments of real-world driving. Beneath its practical charm, the Renault 16 was fragile, unpredictable, and occasionally dangerous. A car that showed how thin the line could be between genius and recklessness in automotive design. At first glance, the Renault 16 looked as if it had been designed in two separate studios and hastily merged together. Its long, drooping front end seemed borrowed from a conventional sedan, while its abrupt, chopped-off rear gave it a strange, uneven profile. Many drivers joked that the car looked like it was melting forward. The proportions were so odd that people were never quite sure what they were looking at. Not a wagon, not a sedan, not a coupe, but something awkwardly in between. Yet this strange shape hid an extraordinary innovation, a full hatchback rear door that opened into a flexible, modular interior. The rear seats could be folded, adjusted, or even removed entirely, transforming the car from a five-seater into a small van in minutes. For families, it was a miracle. For safety engineers, however, it was a nightmare. Renault had chosen lightness and simplicity as design virtues. The R16's body was made from thin steel to reduce weight and improve fuel efficiency. Unfortunately, this also made it dangerously weak. In side impacts, the doors bent inward with alarming ease, and in frontal collisions, the front end crumpled unpredictably, sometimes folding under the passenger compartment instead of absorbing the impact. There was no reinforced subframe, no crossmember protection, and no roll bar. Drivers involved in moderate-speed accidents often discovered that the entire car twisted slightly out of alignment, a quirk that caused doors and windows to jam afterward. One French mechanic in the late 1960s quipped that if you crashed an R16 once, it never opens straight again. The Renault 16's mechanical layout was also unorthodox and problematic. Its engine was mounted longitudinally but drove the front wheels, which made servicing difficult and handling peculiar. Because of its tall suspension and light body, the car leaned dramatically in corners, sometimes so far that passengers feared it might topple. The column-mounted shifter was meant to free up floor space, but often betrayed drivers at the worst possible moment. It had a tendency to jam between gears, especially when downshifting from third to second. In heavy Parisian traffic, this was a disaster. Cars behind often had to swerve to avoid a stalled R16 in the middle of an intersection. On the open road, the Renault 16 was soft, comfortable, and eerily quiet, traits that initially impressed journalists. But comfort came at the cost of stability. Its suspension, tuned for French country roads, made it bounce and sway on highways, and crosswinds could throw it offline with little warning. Many owners complained that above 100 kilometers per hour, the car seemed to float like a balloon. In the rain, the light front end struggled for grip, and braking distances were alarmingly long due to the small drum brakes on early models. There were reports of the rear axle twisting slightly under load, making the car track sideways under braking, a terrifying sensation described by one driver as being pulled by an invisible rope into the ditch. Inside, however, the Renault 16 was a revelation. The seats were soft and supportive, the ride supple, and the sense of space almost luxurious. The cabin could be rearranged like furniture, seats folded, slid, or even reclined completely flat. French families adored its practicality. The car was ideal for long vacations to the countryside, for picnics, or for transporting everything from furniture to bicycles. Yet the same lightweight materials that made the R16 flexible also made it frail. The dashboard was thin plastic that cracked easily in sunlight, the wiring harnesses aged poorly, and the door hinges were so weak that many cars developed sagging doors within a few years. The tailgate seals leaked constantly, turning the rear cargo area into a shallow pool after heavy rain. Despite these issues, the Renault 16 was a sales success. It sold over 1.8 million units and even won the prestigious European Car of the Year award in 1966. But behind its commercial triumph lurked a darker reputation among mechanics and used car dealers. The R16 aged poorly. Rust attacked the thin steel mercilessly, especially around the wheel arches and the floor pan. The electrical system, fragile even when new, failed spectacularly with age, leading to flickering headlights, dead gauges, and mysterious starting failures. One frustrated owner wrote in a French motoring magazine, "I never know if my R16 will start, steer, or stop, but it will always leak." Accident data from the late 1960s and early 1970s showed that Renault 16 occupants were far more likely to suffer serious injuries in collisions compared to drivers of similar-sized cars like the Peugeot 404 or Volkswagen Type 3. The reason was simple. The car's structure absorbed energy unevenly, causing the cabin to deform in unpredictable ways. Renault's engineers would later learn from these mistakes, applying their experience to the far safer Renault 20 and 30 models that followed. But for the generation that owned the Renault 16, it remained a car of contradictions. Brilliant, yet brittle, comfortable, yet dangerous, beloved, yet mistrusted. Today, the Renault 16 is remembered as both a pioneer and a problem child. It invented the family hatchback formula that would define European car design for decades, influencing icons like the Volkswagen Golf and Ford Focus. Yet it also served as a reminder that innovation without safety can be a deadly combination. Collectors admire its quirkiness and forward-thinking layout, but few forget how vulnerable it was in an era before crumple zones and reinforced cabins. The Renault 16 was a masterpiece of practicality trapped in the body of a fragile experiment, a car that tried to reinvent the family vehicle but forgot the basic rule of survival. A car that bends too easily will eventually break. For all its ingenuity, it earned a reputation not as the safest car in France, but as one of the most deceptively dangerous. A graceful, lopsided pioneer that gave drivers comfort, freedom, and more than a few near-death experiences on the open road.
The AMC Pacer prototype of 1969 was one of those strange, ambitious dreams that seemed to come straight out of a designer's fevered imagination, and perhaps should have stayed there.
Conceived in the optimistic years of the space age, when carmakers believed the future would be full of bold shapes and glass bubbles, the Pacer was AMC's attempt to prove that a small American car could look advanced and exciting. Unfortunately, what they created looked less like the future and more like something escaped from an aquarium exhibit. Its massive glass canopy and rounded silhouette earned it early nicknames like the fishbowl and the terrarium on wheels. But behind that bizarre design was a genuinely daring experiment, one that would eventually mutate into the notorious production Pacer of the 1970s, a car that would later inspire the even stranger Pontiac Aztek. In 1969, American Motors was fighting for survival. The Big Three, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, controlled almost everything, and AMC needed something radical to stand out. Their engineers dreamed of a wide, small car, one that combined compact exterior dimensions with the spacious interior of a full-size sedan. To achieve this, AMC designers began experimenting with radically curved glass, short overhangs, and a bubble-like cabin that pushed visibility to the extreme. The prototype that emerged was astonishingly wide for its length and wrapped in glass from nearly every angle. There was almost no metal above the beltline, just thick, heat-absorbing panels that made the driver feel like they were sitting inside a greenhouse speeding down the highway. On paper, it sounded visionary. In person, it was overwhelming. The front windshield extended far up into the roofline, the doors were massive and deeply curved, and the rear hatch sloped like the shell of a turtle. The prototype's designers boasted about universal visibility, claiming the driver could see everything around them. That turned out to be true. They could see everything, but so could the sun. Inside, the Pacer became a mobile oven. The greenhouse effect was so intense that test engineers joked about baking cookies on the dashboard. The air conditioning system, never designed to handle such a heat load, struggled hopelessly, blowing lukewarm air against windows that radiated like stove burners. AMC engineers soon realized that their futuristic fishbowl came with another deadly flaw. It had almost no structural rigidity. The curved glass and thin pillars, while beautiful in sketches, offered little resistance to torsional stress. In crash simulations, the body flexed alarmingly. During an actual rollover test, the roof crumpled inward like foil, completely crushing the passenger compartment. Photographs from AMC's testing archives, rarely seen outside the company, reportedly showed the roof folding down to seat level, with shards of glass scattered like glitter over the test dummies. One engineer dryly remarked, "We've just built a panoramic coffin." The Pacer's wide stance was supposed to improve handling, but it created its own problems. With its stubby wheelbase and enormous width, it turned like a shopping cart with one wheel stuck. At higher speeds, crosswinds pushed it sideways, and its unconventional proportions caused dangerous lift at the front. AMC's experimental steering setup, using recycled components from larger models, made the car feel both twitchy and sluggish at once. Test drivers described it as driving a goldfish bowl during an earthquake. Still, AMC's management didn't want to abandon the idea completely. The company's designers, led by the famously eccentric Dick Teague, believed the Pacer's futuristic form could work with refinement. They shelved the prototype and continued developing the concept quietly throughout the early 1970s, updating it to meet new crash and emissions standards. When the final AMC Pacer debuted in 1975, it bore a strong resemblance to the original 1969 prototype, though with slightly more metal and slightly less glass. The result was still strange, but now it was at least buildable. The wide, small car became one of the oddest production vehicles of the decade, mocked, misunderstood, and decades ahead of its time. Ironically, the Pacer prototype's failure taught AMC many painful lessons about safety and aerodynamics, but also inspired one of the most infamous design lineages in American car history. Its bulbous proportions and awkward stance echoed decades later in the Pontiac Aztek,
Another car mocked for its bizarre looks, but based on similarly noble intentions, to be practical, futuristic, and different. Like the Pacer, the Aztec was too far ahead for its audience and too strange for mass acceptance. It's no coincidence that both cars share the same tragic reputation: noble ideas turned into aesthetic disasters. From a technical standpoint, the 1969 Pacer prototype was a dead end, an unsafe, unbalanced, and overheated experiment that had no business sharing the road with real cars. But from a cultural perspective, it was pure 1960s optimism made metal. It represented a time when American engineers believed in pushing limits, when even small companies like AMC dared to think beyond the ordinary sedan. They wanted to make cars that looked like spaceships and felt like the future. In that sense, the Pacer prototype was a genuine product of its age, bold, naive, and beautifully wrong. Today, only a handful of photographs and company sketches of the 1969 Pacer prototype survive, locked away in the archives of collectors and historians. It remains one of the strangest what-if stories in automotive design, a forgotten ancestor of cars that dared to be different, even if it meant being ridiculous. The prototype was never meant for production, but its ghost lived on, haunting the American imagination through every oddball design that followed. If the 1969 AMC Pacer prototype had a legacy, it's this. It showed the world that innovation without restraint can be as dangerous as stagnation. It proved that too much glass, too little structure, and too much ambition could make even the most futuristic car a rolling catastrophe. It was the missing evolutionary link between the optimism of the 1960s and the design chaos of the 2000s, the true grandfather of the Pontiac Aztec, and a reminder that sometimes the future looks best when left unrealized.
The Fiat 600 Multipla, built between 1956 and 1969, though most commonly seen in its 1960s form, was one of the strangest and most hazardous vehicles ever to roll out of Italy, a machine that blurred the line between genius and madness. Designed during a time when Europe was still recovering from the scars of war and cities were bursting with new families and tiny cars, Fiat wanted to create something revolutionary, a compact people carrier, a family van for the everyman. What they built was, in essence, a minivan decades ahead of its time, but also a monument to unsafe engineering. It was a car so small, so oddly arranged, and so physically dangerous that sitting behind the wheel felt like volunteering to be the car's crumple zone. The Fiat Multipla was based on the tiny Fiat 600 city car, a humble rear-engine runabout with barely 25 horsepower, and a wheelbase shorter than a modern smart car. Fiat's engineers, faced with the impossible task of turning that minuscule platform into a 6-passenger family hauler, decided to think vertically and spatially rather than structurally. They moved the driver's seat far forward, so far, in fact, that the driver and front passenger sat directly above the front axle, with their knees mere inches behind the headlights. There was no engine in front, no real bulkhead, and no meaningful separation between the driver's legs and whatever the car might hit. In the event of a frontal collision, there was literally nothing between you and the oncoming object but a thin sheet of metal and your own luck. Fiat promoted this peculiar layout as maximizing interior space. It certainly did. You could fit 6 people in something barely longer than a modern Fiat 500, but it did so by eliminating any idea of safety. The driver's shins were the de facto crumple zone, and the steering column, long and rigid, pointed directly at the driver's chest like a spear. In Italy's congested post-war streets, where traffic accidents were frequent and chaotic, this design led to horrifying results. Survivors of front-end collisions often described their Multipla folding like a concertina, with the windshield collapsing inward and the dashboard crushing the driver's torso. Adding insult to injury, the engine sat underneath the front seats in early versions,
a strange decision that led to constant overheating and cabin heat so intense that owners joked you could cook pasta under the dashboard. Later variants moved the engine to the rear, improving balance slightly, but doing little to help the car's chronic instability. The tiny 633cc four-cylinder, designed for the light Fiat 600, was now tasked with hauling 6 people and their luggage. Fully loaded, the Multipla struggled to exceed 55 miles per hour, and on steep Italian hills, drivers often had to downshift to first gear just to keep moving. When it did reach highway speeds, its high center of gravity and narrow track made it sway alarmingly. In crosswinds, it behaved like a sailboat without a keel. Braking, too, was an adventure in terror. The Multipla used small drum brakes borrowed from the base 600, which faded quickly under load. Descending mountain roads required planning, prayer, and occasionally the handbrake. Early Italian driving instructors often used the Multipla to demonstrate the limits of mechanical courage. The steering, unassisted and vague, gave little warning before the front wheels lost grip, and when the car slid, it did so unpredictably, usually towards the nearest ditch or wall. Structurally, the Multipla's shell was made of lightweight steel panels that were thin enough to dent with a firm push. There were no door reinforcements, no rollover structure, and no safety glass. Inside impacts, the doors folded inward like tinfoil, and in rollovers, the roof simply caved in. One Italian journalist writing for Quattrore in the mid-1960s described crash tests as a study of human fragility. The car remains, the people disappear. And yet, for all its flaws, the Fiat 600 Multipla was weirdly charming. It was friendly, economical, and ingeniously packaged. Taxi drivers in Rome and Milan adored it, as it could weave through traffic while carrying entire families and luggage. Its panoramic windows made it perfect for sightseeing, and its upright seating gave passengers the illusion of space. Tourists loved riding in it, right until they realized that a Vespa crashing into its nose could easily send them all to the hospital. In a sense, the Multipla was both a miracle of creativity and a monument to how little car safety mattered in mid-century Europe. Fiat's engineers had achieved their goal, to make the world's smallest family car, but they had done so by sacrificing every ounce of protection. It was a car born from optimism, built for a time when people still believed that driving slowly meant driving safely, and that clever design could solve anything. Unfortunately, physics had other ideas. By the late 1960s, as highway speeds increased and car safety became a serious concern, the Multipla's flaws became impossible to ignore. The rise of the Fiat 124 and 128, larger, faster, and somewhat safer, made the Multipla look like a relic from a more reckless era. Production quietly ended in 1969, with Fiat pretending the car had never existed. Today, collectors view the Fiat 600 Multipla as a quirky, lovable piece of design history, a grandparent of the modern minivan, and an icon of Italy's economic miracle. But those who have driven one know better. It's a museum piece best admired from a distance. Behind its smiling face lies a car that could turn even a gentle fender bender into a fatal event. It was the embodiment of Italian ingenuity and Italian indifference, a people carrier that treated its people as an afterthought. In the end, the Fiat 600 Multipla remains both a triumph and a tragedy, the birth of a new automotive idea executed with none of the safety we now take for granted. It was clever, charming, and catastrophically unsafe, a car that looked like a cartoon and behaved like one in a crash. It may have paved the way for the family van, but it did so with its passengers sitting inches from disaster. By the late 1960s, the Ford Thunderbird had lost its soul. What began in 1955 as a light, elegant, two-seat American answer to the European Grand Tourer had, by 1967, mutated into something bloated and confused, a monument to excess chrome and misguided ambition. The 1967 to 1969 Thunderbird marked the moment when Ford, chasing luxury and gimmicks, completely forgot what made the car special in the first place. Once a symbol of beauty, grace, and American optimism, it became a rolling contradiction. Part muscle car, part luxury barge, and part death trap. Ford's intentions were noble, at least on paper. They wanted to move the Thunderbird upmarket, to turn it from a personal sports car into a personal luxury car, competing with the Buick Riviera and Oldsmobile Toronado. But the result was a car that tried to be everything at once and failed spectacularly at all of it. The clean, elegant lines of the original Thunderbird were replaced by a slab-sided bulk that stretched nearly 18 feet long. The new body sat low and wide, but not gracefully. It looked crushed and swollen, as if it were sinking under its own weight. Designers added hidden headlights, faux jet intakes, and enough chrome to blind pedestrians in sunlight. The rear end, with its blocky tail fins and massive tail lights, was pure theater and pure absurdity. Underneath, the problems ran even deeper. The new Thunderbird weighed nearly 4,500 pounds, a shocking figure for a car that once prided itself on agility. Ford's engineers tried to tame the mass by equipping it with massive 429 cubic inch V8s and later 460s. Power wasn't the issue. These engines could produce over 360 horsepower. But all that strength was wasted on a chassis that flexed like a diving board. The suspension was soft and floaty, tuned more for isolation than control, and the steering was so over-assisted that it felt disconnected from the road entirely. One journalist from Car Life in 1968 described it as a car that glides beautifully in a straight line and panics the moment you ask it to turn. Owners quickly discovered that driving a Thunderbird of this era was an act of patience and faith. At highway speeds, the car wandered, leaning alarmingly in corners and taking several seconds to respond to steering input. Braking, meanwhile, was an exercise in terror. Despite its mass, the Thunderbird was equipped with small front disc brakes and rear drums that faded easily under heat. Stopping from 70 miles per hour nearly took 200 feet, and that was when everything was new and properly adjusted. Many owners complained that after 2 or 3 hard stops, the brake pedal went soft, leaving them to pray their power steering pump could guide them toward a safe ditch. Inside, Ford continued its obsession with over-design. The dashboard was a glittering maze of chrome switches, fake wood, and sharp-edged trim that looked like something from a 1950s sci-fi movie. The seats were comfortable enough, but the interior was a labyrinth of dangerous details. The steering wheel was a hard, thin ring of metal and brittle plastic with a sharp horn ring positioned directly in line with the driver's chest. In an accident, it became a spear. The doors, lined with thick chrome handles and protruding levers, could cut or crush limbs. Even the center console was a hazard, a gleaming metal ridge that rose between the seats, ready to bruise knees and ribs during hard stops. Ford's marketing department tried to spin these flaws as modern design. They promoted the Thunderbird as a technological wonder, boasting features like sequential rear turn signals, hidden headlamps, and power everything. But these innovations came at the cost of reliability. The power windows often jammed mid-motion, the hidden headlamps failed to open in rain, and the complex vacuum-operated systems leaked constantly. Mechanics joked that a late 1960s Thunderbird was 2 tons of wiring and wishful thinking. The car's size also created a false sense of safety. Drivers assumed that its sheer bulk would protect them in crashes, but the opposite was true. The Thunderbird's long hood and weak structure caused it to crumble unpredictably in front-end collisions, with the heavy engine often intruding into the cabin. The steering column was rigid and uncollapsible, meaning it could impale the driver even in a moderate crash. The sharp-edged dashboard and chromed interior trim turned minor accidents into bloody disasters.
period crash tests showed horrifying results. Front passengers suffered catastrophic injuries at speeds as low as 30 miles per hour. By 1969, even Ford insiders admitted the Thunderbird had lost its way. What was once a symbol of freedom and sophistication had become an overweight dinosaur, more suited for slow parades than open highways. The model's reputation for quality and style plummeted. Owners called it the old man sports car, while others were blunter, a coffin with tail fins. Dealers quietly acknowledged that many cars came back within months for suspension repairs, brake overhauls, or electrical failures. But in a strange way,
The Reliant Regal of the mid to late 1960s stands today as one of the strangest, most ill-conceived vehicles ever to roll out of a British factory. A machine that perfectly captured the nation's obsession with frugality and eccentricity, but also one that defied the basic laws of physics. This was the car that dared to challenge logic itself. 3 wheels, a fiberglass body, and an engine barely strong enough to power a lawnmower. The Regal was born from necessity, designed for post-war Britain's narrow roads and tighter wallets. But what it became was something entirely unintended, a national joke and, in many cases, a national hazard. Built in Tamworth by Reliant Motor Company, the Regal was originally envisioned as a practical, lightweight car that anyone could afford. It promised fuel efficiency, cheap tax rates, and the simplicity of a motorcycle with the comfort of a car. On paper, it made sense. In reality, it was a rolling paradox. Because of its 3-wheel design, 1 lonely wheel up front and 2 at the rear, the Regal was officially classified as a motorcycle for tax purposes, meaning owners could drive it on a motorbike license and pay lower registration fees. This clever legal loophole made it appealing to thousands of thrifty Britons in the 1960s, particularly those who couldn't afford a full-sized car. Unfortunately, that front-wheel design also made it one of the most inherently unstable vehicles ever built. The engineering problem was simple but catastrophic. All of the steering and weight distribution relied on that single front wheel. Turn too sharply, and the car's high center of gravity and narrow track combined to lift one of the rear wheels clean off the ground. Many owners described the same heart-stopping experience. The moment the Regal began to tilt mid-turn, the driver realizing too late that the car had already decided to roll. Once it began to tip, there was nothing to do but hang on and hope it didn't land on its roof. The press nicknamed it the Tumbler, and British police officers joked that Regal rollovers were as common as flat tires on the motorways. It wasn't just the handling that made the Regal dangerous. Its body was constructed entirely from fiberglass, a material that was cheap, light, and immune to rust, but catastrophically fragile in a collision. Unlike steel, which bends or crumples, fiberglass shatters. In a crash, the Regal's panels exploded into thousands of razor-sharp shards, turning even minor fender benders into showers of splinters. Survivors recalled emerging from accidents looking as though they'd been attacked by a swarm of glass bees. The car's lack of any safety structure meant that even low-speed impacts could be fatal. There were no crumple zones, no side beams, and no seat belts in most models. The driver and passenger sat just inches away from the paper-thin front wall and the exposed engine bay, a terrifying thought if you ever found yourself heading toward another vehicle or a lamppost. The engine was also a curiosity. Early versions used a tiny 600cc 4-cylinder engine that produced less than 30 horsepower, just enough to move the car, but not enough to make it stable. Drivers often complained that crosswinds on the motorway could literally blow the car off course.
Others noted that heavy braking would cause the entire body to nosedive forward, sometimes lifting one or both rear wheels clear off the ground. The braking distance from 60 miles per hour was laughably bad. And that was assuming you could even reach 60 miles per hour, since the car vibrated violently above 50. Inside, the experience was as Spartan as it gets. The cabin was a bare shell of plastic and vinyl, with seats that felt like folding chairs and instrumentation that seemed borrowed from a motorcycle. The dashboard was so thin that it could flex under your hand, and the steering column jutted forward at a dangerous angle, ready to impale the driver in a collision. Ventilation was poor, the heater barely worked, and water often leaked through the seals in heavy rain. Yet, despite all of this, the Regal had a strange charm. It represented something uniquely British, an underdog spirit, a sort of mechanical optimism that believed clever design could conquer limitations. Unfortunately, the laws of physics were not so easily fooled. By the late 1960s, the Regal's reputation had already begun to sour. Reports of accidents involving rollovers and shattered bodies became common, and insurers started raising premiums on the model. Reliant tried to fix the problem by lowering the center of gravity and stiffening the suspension, but these tweaks barely helped. The car remained notoriously twitchy, especially on uneven roads. Motorists behind the wheel learned to approach roundabouts with both fear and reverence, taking turns at walking pace to avoid the humiliating and dangerous spectacle of tipping over in front of a bus queue. And yet, for all its faults, the Reliant Regal became something of a cult figure in British popular culture. Its absurd design made it instantly recognizable, and its successors, particularly the Reliant Robin, would go on to achieve comedic immortality. From television shows like Only Fools and Horses to endless jokes in pubs and magazines, the three-wheeled Reliants became a symbol of cheerful British eccentricity. People laughed at them, mocked them, and occasionally loved them, but few forgot them. Behind the humor, though, was a darker truth. The Regal's combination of lightweight materials, top-heavy design, and primitive safety engineering made it genuinely lethal in the wrong hands. What was meant to be a humble solution to post-war transportation shortages became one of the most dangerous cars ever legally sold to the public. Looking back today, the Reliant Regal feels like a time capsule from a different world, a world where economy mattered more than safety, and where engineers, armed with ambition and compromise, created machines that defied reason. It was clumsy, comical, and catastrophically unsafe, yet somehow endearingly British. The Regal didn't just tip over on the road, it toppled straight into history, forever remembered as the little car that couldn't keep its balance. The Toyota Publica Sports, produced between 1965 and 1969, was one of those rare cars that seemed doomed by good intentions. It was born from a sincere dream to give post-war Japan an affordable, sporty coupe that captured the excitement of European motoring. But what emerged was a dangerously fragile little machine that looked like a toy and drove like a dare. Conceived as a stylish offshoot of Toyota's humble Publica economy car, it was meant to symbolize youth, freedom, and the optimism of a modernizing Japan. Yet behind the charming lines and bright colors lurked one of the most unsafe small cars the company ever built, a vehicle so unstable and fragile that even its own engineers later admitted it was too light to live, too slow to matter. The Publica Sports began as a design exercise by Shozo Sato and Shozo Kadama, Toyota's young stylists who idolized the Fiat 850 Spider and the Honda S600. The goal was to create something sleek and exciting, but affordable, a sports car for the masses. To achieve that, Toyota used the same basic platform as the Publica sedan, a car designed not for performance, but for economy. They gave it a low, rounded coupe body, pop-up headlights, and a minimalist interior meant to evoke Italian flair. But beneath the glamour was the same underpowered, two-cylinder air-cooled 700cc engine that powered the base Publica, an engine that produced barely 28 horsepower on a good day. 0 to 60 was not a measurement Toyota ever published. In truth, the car could barely reach 60 miles per hour at all, and only if you were going downhill with a tailwind. Despite the sporty aspirations, the engineering bordered on reckless. To keep weight low and costs down, Toyota used ultra-thin steel panels and minimal reinforcement. The entire car weighed barely 1,200 pounds, which made it feel nimble at parking speeds, but terrifyingly unstable at highway velocity. The chassis flexed so badly that even moderate cornering could cause the body to twist visibly. At higher speeds, the car developed a disturbing tendency to lift at the front, a result of poor aerodynamics and front-end lightness. Testers noted that the steering became vague and wandering, especially above 50 miles per hour, which, unfortunately, was near its top speed. Then there was the issue of safety, or rather, the complete absence of it. The Publica Sports was built at a time when Japanese automakers, still finding their footing in the global market, placed little emphasis on crash protection. The front end had almost no structural reinforcement, and in crash tests, even at modest speeds, it crumpled like a tin can. The front suspension struts were mounted so close to the cabin firewall that in a head-on collision, they could puncture directly into the passenger footwell. The steering column was a solid rod aimed directly at the driver's chest, and the dashboard was stamped steel, unpadded and sharp. There were no seatbelts in early models, no energy absorption, and no crumple zones, only faith and hope. One particularly grim road test conducted by a Japanese automotive magazine in 1967 reported that during simulated frontal impacts at 30 miles per hour, the engine block was pushed into the cabin, crushing the pedals and the driver's legs. The report concluded diplomatically that the car was not recommended for expressway use. Drivers quickly learned that the safest way to experience the Publica Sports was not to drive it fast at all. Many owners joked that its top speed was as fast as you dared before it started shaking. The car's performance was equally disappointing. The tiny engine, mounted up front and driving the rear wheels, struggled to move the car with any urgency. Acceleration was glacial, and overtaking even a city bus was an act of faith. The gearbox, though precise, was not enough to hide the lack of torque. Fuel economy was excellent, but that was small comfort when you realized you could pedal a bicycle with nearly the same efficiency. Toyota's engineers tried to offset the lack of speed by touting its style and comfort, but the cramped cabin and tinny construction made it feel less like a sports car and more like a metal cocoon on wheels. Even Japanese customers, known for their loyalty to domestic brands, were skeptical. Sales were miserable. Reviewers in Japan's Motor Fan magazine praised its looks but condemned its road behavior, calling it too unstable for fast roads and a car to be admired at a stoplight, not driven beyond it. Owners complained of endless rattles, body flex, and frequent mechanical failures. The engine overheated easily, especially during summer drives, and the lightweight suspension components wore out prematurely on rough roads. Worse, when the car did crash, and many did, the results were devastating. Police reports from the late 1960s documented several fatalities in low-speed collisions where the cabin simply folded in half. Toyota knew the car was a mistake long before production ended. By 1969, they quietly withdrew it from the market, replacing it with the far more robust and better engineered Corolla Sprinter.
The Simca 1000, produced from 1961 to 1970, was one of France's most notorious examples of a compact car that promised practicality but delivered peril. On paper, it was perfect for the post-war European motorist, small, affordable, and efficient. Its rear-engine layout allowed for a spacious interior relative to its tiny footprint, and it sported simple mechanicals that were cheap to repair. Yet, what made the car appealing on the streets of Paris and Marseille was exactly what made it frightening on faster roads: its rear-heavy configuration. Weighing just over 1,500 pounds, the Simca 1000 had almost all of that mass concentrated over the rear axle. This gave it a reputation for being twitchy, unpredictable, and sometimes downright suicidal in corners. Unlike front-engine cars of the era, which tended to understeamer gracefully, the Simca had a notorious oversteer problem. Lift your foot off the throttle mid-turn, and the rear end could swing violently outward, catching even experienced drivers off guard. Testers of the era described it as a car that behaves differently every day, a polite way of saying it had no consistent handling. The brakes, small and drum-based, were woefully underpowered for the car's performance. Long descents, tight turns, or wet roads were a recipe for disaster, as the Simca would fade unpredictably and refuse to stop efficiently. Combine that with a narrow, high-profile body, and you had a car that could easily roll if the rear slipped. On twisty mountain passes, not uncommon in southern France, accidents were almost inevitable for the uninitiated. Its suspension, simple and lightweight, did little to tame the car's antics. Minor bumps or uneven surfaces could unsettle the chassis, amplifying the tendency to spin. Many early owners recounted learning the hard way how sensitive the Simca was to weight shifts, throttle modulation, and steering inputs. Even minor evasive maneuvers could result in a sudden loss of control. Safety equipment was minimal. No crumple zones, no seat belts in early models, and a rigid steel cabin that transmitted impact forces directly to occupants. Collisions were rarely survivable beyond low speeds. Despite its dangers, the Simca 1000 found a niche among city drivers who valued affordability over performance. Mechanics appreciated its simplicity, and the small rear engine made urban parking a breeze. Yet what made the car appealing on the streets of Paris and Marseille was exactly what made it frightening on faster roads. Its rear-heavy configuration also contributed to its reputation as a driver's nightmare. Its tall, narrow stance made it top-heavy, and the suspension geometry magnified the oversteer. European car magazines repeatedly warned that the Simca 1000 required careful handling, especially in wet or winding conditions, but young drivers, the very demographic it appealed to, often ignored the advice. The result was a generation of terrified mechanics, insurance adjusters, and emergency responders who learned firsthand how deadly a small rear-engined hatchback could be. In retrospect, the Simca 1000 is remembered as a perfect storm of lightweight, rear-engine instability, and minimal safety features. It was charming, economical, and practical in urban traffic, but on anything resembling a spirited road, it became a fragile, twitchy death trap. Collectors today value the car for its rarity and its role in European automotive history, but any discussion of the Simca 1000 is incomplete without acknowledging its dark side, a car that demanded respect, skill, and nerves of steel, otherwise it would turn on you without mercy. In the end, the Simca 1000 is a cautionary tale of 1960s automotive design, a car that achieved efficiency and utility at the cost of predictability and safety, earning its place in history not just as a practical French compact, but as one of the deadliest small cars of its era. The Chevrolet Corvair, produced from 1960 through 1969, occupies a unique and notorious place in American automotive history. Remembered as both an ambitious engineering experiment and a cautionary tale about the perils of innovation without adequate safety foresight. It was GM's bold attempt to create a domestic, European-style compact car, a vehicle that could compete with imported small cars in efficiency, handling, and style, yet still carry the hallmark American flair for design and power. The Corvair featured a radical rear-mounted, air-cooled flat-six engine, independent suspension all around, and an exceptionally low weight, which gave it an image of modernity and nimbleness that American consumers were not used to. On the surface, it promised sophistication and excitement. In reality, it became a symbol of the unintended consequences when design novelty and cost-cutting overshadowed fundamental safety considerations. The earliest Corvairs, produced from 1960 through 1969, were the most problematic. Their rear-engine layout, combined with a very short rear swing axle without a front stabilizer bar, created a handling dynamic that was highly unpredictable. With most of the vehicle's mass concentrated at the rear, the Corvair had a strong tendency to oversteer, especially in sudden maneuvers, sharp turns, or during abrupt lane changes. Even experienced drivers reported the car would sometimes fishtail without warning, spinning violently in corners or under panic steering. On wet or slick roads, this behavior became even more pronounced, and in extreme cases, these spinouts could escalate into full rollovers. For a vehicle marketed as a practical, everyday family car, the Corvair's handling was unforgiving, and it could punish minor errors with catastrophic consequences. Adding to the danger, the Corvair's early models had a steering column and dashboard design that offered minimal protection in collisions. The column was rigid, and without collapsible mechanisms or cushioning, it could act as a spear in frontal impacts. The cabin structure itself lacked modern crumple zones or side reinforcement, meaning that energy from collisions was transmitted directly to the occupants. In rear-end accidents, the flat-six engine layout sometimes compounded the risk, and the combination of lightweight body panels and minimal interior padding made crashes far more severe than they would have been in sturdier contemporaries. Even minor accidents could result in broken bones or severe injuries because there was little to absorb the impact. The situation drew national attention in 1965 when consumer advocate Ralph Nader published Unsafe at Any Speed, a groundbreaking exposé on the Corvair. Nader meticulously detailed the car's instability, highlighting both the engineering flaws and GM's lack of response to early warnings from internal tests and consumer complaints. He described the car as a public menace due to its propensity for spinouts and rollovers. His investigation revealed that GM executives had been dismissive of complaints and in some cases had attempted to discredit critics rather than address the fundamental handling issues. This created a firestorm of public scrutiny that would shape automotive safety regulations for decades. In response to the growing criticism, Chevrolet implemented several changes to the Corvair starting with the 1955 model year. These included adding a front stabilizer bar, improving rear suspension geometry, and making minor chassis reinforcements. While these modifications improved handling and reduced the car's tendency to oversteer, the stigma had already taken root. The Corvair's early reputation for being unpredictable and potentially deadly followed it for the rest of its production run. Insurance companies treated the Corvair as high risk, and consumer confidence never fully recovered. Enthusiasts appreciated the rear engine setup and the car's unique mechanical design, but to the general public, it remained a cautionary tale: stylish, innovative, and undeniably dangerous if mishandled. The Corvair's influence extended beyond its immediate dangers. It sparked national debate on automobile safety, influencing legislation that led to the creation of the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1966. It became an example of why crashworthiness, stability, and occupant protection could not be optional, even in economy or stylish vehicles. Automakers learned, sometimes painfully, that innovative layouts, such as rear engines or lightweight constructions, required rigorous safety engineering to avoid disaster. Yet for all its flaws, the Corvair was more than a textbook example of failure. Its independent suspension, air-cooled rear engine, and lightweight frame influenced future vehicle design in ways that could be admired in isolation. Enthusiasts today restore and race early Corvairs, often retrofitting them with modern suspension components to tame their infamous oversteer. These cars now offer a glimpse into what might have been if GM had combined their ambitious vision with proper safety foresight from the start. In practical terms,
the Zaporozhets ZAZ-966, produced in Soviet Ukraine from 1966 to 1972, was meant to be the Soviet answer to the growing demand for compact, affordable automobiles. It was designed to put more families on the road, to modernize personal transport in a country where vehicles were still a luxury for most citizens. On paper, the car was compact, rear-engined, and economical, a people's car in the truest sense. In reality, it was a mechanical and safety disaster waiting to happen. The ZAZ 966 inherited its rear-mounted, air-cooled engine from earlier Zaporozhet's models, but engineers pushed the design into a body that was far too small and lightly constructed to cope with the power and heat it generated. The engine was prone to overheating, especially on long trips or in the warmer months, and spontaneous fires were not unheard of. The cooling system was minimal, and the cramped rear compartment allowed heat to build rapidly, often leading to mechanical failures that could leave the driver stranded or worse. Owners joked that carrying a bucket of water in the trunk was a wise precaution, though in reality it did little to mitigate the real hazards. The suspension system was another major flaw. Using simple torsion bars and minimal damping, the ZAZ 966 had a habit of hopping or skidding unpredictably, especially on uneven or icy roads, which were common throughout the USSR. Drivers reported that at even modest speeds, hitting a pothole or uneven surface could send the tiny car bouncing across lanes, a terrifying experience on narrow country roads or busy urban streets. Steering was vague and underpowered, meaning that sudden evasive maneuvers were almost impossible to execute safely. Safety engineering in the Soviet Union at the time was virtually non-existent, and the ZAZ 966 reflected that. Its steel shell was thin, with little reinforcement to protect occupants in collisions. Crumple zones were absent, seatbelts were rare or poorly mounted, and the doors were flimsy enough to bend in a side impact, leaving passengers exposed. In frontal collisions, the small cabin often collapsed inward, and the rear-mounted engine sometimes compounded the danger by intruding into the passenger compartment. The ZAZ 966 was a car that demanded constant vigilance. Any mistake could quickly escalate into disaster. Despite these flaws, the ZAZ 966 became widespread across the USSR because it was affordable and available. For many Soviet families, it was the only way to achieve personal mobility, and citizens quickly learned to respect or fear its quirks. The car's diminutive size and compact layout made it ideal for the narrow city streets and crowded roads of Soviet towns, but those advantages could not offset its structural weaknesses. Driving a ZAZ 966 required patience, foresight, and a healthy dose of luck, as even minor accidents could result in severe injuries or fatalities. Owners often shared grim humor about the vehicle, acknowledging that it demanded both mechanical ingenuity and divine protection. The car's reputation for unreliability, frequent overheating, and unpredictable handling earned it nicknames like the prayer car, a darkly humorous acknowledgement of its dangers. Mechanics working on the ZAZ 966 had to be inventive, often fabricating parts or improvising solutions to keep the tiny vehicle operational, further underscoring the car's precarious engineering. In many ways, the ZAZ 966 symbolizes the contradictions of Soviet-era automotive design: simple, affordable, and widely produced, yet fragile, unsafe, and mechanically temperamental. It was a car that could get you from point A to point B if handled with care, but it demanded constant attention, cautious driving, and an acceptance of its inherent risks. For Soviet drivers, the ZAZ 966 was both a blessing and a curse, a path to personal mobility that carried a persistent undercurrent of danger. Today, surviving ZAZ 966 are rare curiosities, admired for their historical significance rather than their practicality or safety. Collectors and enthusiasts often restore them as pieces of Eastern Bloc history, but they remain reminders of an era when cheap, small cars were built without consideration for modern safety standards. Driving one now is a delicate dance with history. You feel the charm of its compact design, the novelty of its rear-engined layout, and the ever-present tension that one misstep could turn the trip into a life-threatening event. The Zaporozhet's ZAZ 966 endures as an icon of Soviet ingenuity constrained by extreme limitations, a car that made every journey a mixture of hope, frustration, and apprehension, earning its dark reputation as a tiny, unstable, and frequently dangerous people's car.